On Life and Meaning is brought to you by Blumenthal Performing Arts, celebrating its 25th year presenting the best in the performing arts, sharing and employing the arts as a major catalyst to strengthen education, building community cohesiveness, and advancing economic growth. Further support is provided by Charlotte Mecklenburg Library, one of America's leading urban public libraries, delivering exceptional services and programs with a mission to improve lives and build a stronger community. And by the Arts and Science Council, Charlotte Mecklenburg's resource hub and lead advocate for the regional cultural community, providing culture for all.
And when the jury comes back, you tremble. And even when the clerk reads the verdict, you tremble. And even through sentencing, all of that is, and the more serious the crime, it's not just you that trembles, but you see the response from jurors and you see the response from judges, and people take this, as they should, extremely seriously. And it's an overwhelming feeling. You look behind you and you see the victims of these cases, and you can see it all just comes washing over them. There's this, for the first time, there's this sense of closure. Often it's, oh my gosh, these people actually believed me. You look over at the defendant and you see, oh my gosh, my life just changed in an instant. You look over at the jury and they realize the true gravity of the decision they just made. And this all plays out in a courtroom.
Spencer Merriweather is Mecklenburg County District Attorney, leading an office of over 200 attorneys and staff who prosecute state felonies and misdemeanor charges. He served as an assistant district attorney in the felony division in Mecklenburg County for more than a decade. He previously led the district attorney's office Habitual Felon prosecution team and has prosecuted a variety of crimes ranging from homicide, robbery, and sexual assault. He has been an active member of the Mecklenburg County Bar and is the incoming director of the Mecklenburg Bar Foundation Board. In this episode, we explore criminal justice reform, the emotional burden of prosecuting defendants, serving as the voice of victims, and being a good brother. I'm Mark Paris, and this is On Life and Meaning. Welcome, Spencer.
Thanks, Mark. Glad to be here.
You were appointed the district attorney for Mecklenburg County in November 2017. What have you learned as district attorney in the last 5 months?
A lot. For one thing, it's an entirely different job from being a trial attorney, and I knew that going in. And the idea of not only having to lead 86 prosecutors and 55 support staff, but really setting a vision. I went from one day preparing a homicide trial and to the next day, all of a sudden I'm in charge. And you immediately have the understanding that it's my vision that sort of dictates the pace and tone of the office. I'm part of a team, but you look around and say, what needs to be done? And you realize that you're the person charged with kind of effectuating that vision. So it was interesting because you look around and you say, if I could be DA, what would I do differently? And instantly you start thinking, well, let's do that. Let's try that. And there's a certain freshness, perhaps even a certain naivete that I think is healthy. There's a certain energy around something that's new, especially with something as instant as an appointment. Literally, you have new leadership without any transition whatsoever. So it's been exciting. But like I said, I instantly became the managing partner of the fourth largest law firm in Charlotte.
What did you identify as something new that you could do?
First thing was the way that we approached people who've made mistakes before. There hadn't really been anybody who talked about returning citizens, and even the notion of me using the term returning citizens is something that probably hasn't been spoken of in the district attorney's office before. And the truth is that, Mecklenburg County has been largely considered a progressive district attorney's office for many years. Peter Gilchrist is someone who led the charge for diversion programs in the 1980s and 1990s. And, I talk about returning citizens now. It's basically saying there are people out there who've made mistakes, and there are ways in which we want to empower them or give them the tools that would empower them to make positive contributions to the community. So one of the first things that, I went about the work of doing was engaging with community organizations who were already trying to develop expunction clinics. They already did that work. That was already set up. But where they did it and how they did it and who was involved was something that I thought I could add to the process. Making sure that people had that access in their government, in their courthouse square, making it accessible. And that's work that we're seeing come to fruition right now.
Of all the initiatives that you could have begun, why did you select that one as important to you?
I thought it was a huge statement to the community at large. When talking to people, I frequently say that, the DA has but a couple steps in a 12-step process in expungement, but in some ways it's the most important step, because the leader of the criminal justice system is saying to the community at large that this person who's made a mistake deserves the right to make a positive contribution again and be unshackled from something that's in their past. And I think that's important. I think that when you hear the DA say that, an employer takes something from that. And when the DA says that, someone who provides housing takes something from that. When the DA says that, maybe the dean of a college, it has a different feel about what someone's criminal past means and what their ability to put that criminal past behind them means. So I think that's a value statement.
Are you a good district attorney?
I am.
What makes you good?
I think the fact that I have never lost sight, this is all about people. If I'm in a quiet moment by myself, you can think back to the people that you've met and the ways in which you've been a part of someone's life. You get in trouble sometimes using analogies, but when I feel like I'm doing my job my best, I do feel as if I've had the same sort of interaction with someone that a doctor has had with them. That you really, in many ways, are a part of somebody's tragedy, but your role in that tragedy is to make their outcome as best as possible. The truth is that you're not going to always be able to give people good news. You're not always going to be able to give them the outcome that you would all want, but the fact that you are there with them and realize that people are not alone when they're going through the process like this in response to a tragedy that they've experienced. Sometimes that tragedy is small. Sometimes it's something that's very seemingly insignificant, but it's not insignificant to them. Sometimes it's something that's horribly traumatic, like the loss of a loved one or a horrible violation of one's person that they've got to live with for the rest of their life. And you become appended to that. And while I've been personally impacted by those experiences in some pretty traumatic ways, I also take a great pride in the fact that I was a part of a process that someone was going through and really made an impact in making sure that person didn't go through it alone.
You're speaking about the work that you did as an assistant district attorney. That's representing right. Victims in the state.
That's right.
What makes you a good district attorney?
As a district attorney, I believe that taking that experience as an assistant DA and never losing sight that this is about people, that no matter what sort of initiatives that I propose, no matter what sort of plans that I implement, that these are things that impact individuals, that they impact neighborhoods, and they impact communities. And, I think a lot of people may come into the job with ideas of grand initiatives and programs. And I will never lose sight of the fact that this impacts single people. I think that I bring a level of empathy to this job. I bring a level of compassion to this job and foresight to this job that makes me good at it.
What could you be better at?
Balance. Because you can pour yourself entirely into certain sectors of the job. And one of the things you realize about being a leader is you're not helping anybody if you're so worn down by the moment that you are not prepared for the next moment. And that's a lesson that I'll be learning the rest of my life. I wasn't terribly good at it as line trial prosecutor. And I assume that with new challenges, I'll have to get better at that as well. people keep telling me how gray my hair has gotten in the last 5 months, excuse me. And they're right, but I'm proud to be hanging on to the cuticles that I have, you know? So.
Spencer, you have used the phrase a 21st century prosecutor.
Right.
What do you mean by that phrase?
I think that there is more to this job than simply being in court. The problems that prosecutor faces on a daily basis are not ones that are within the confines of the North Carolina general statutes. They're not ones that are merely what's presented within the four corners of a courtroom. We live in an atmosphere of great need and great concern, and a 21st century prosecutor has to break outside of the silo of the criminal justice system in the courtroom and really reach out to address the underlying causes of crime. Because when you start reaching out to the hospital and start reaching out to the school and start reaching out to the workplace and start reaching out to the family, that you realize how you can really impact and advance public safety. Because if you're shutting out all of those other sectors of our community and just trying to deal with what's in the courtroom, you're not going to get anywhere. Quite frankly, we have suffered because of an approach to criminal justice that just says, well, we're just going to do us and we're going to let everyone else do them. We can't do that anymore. That's not the world. We're a intricately connected world, and everything about our problems and our challenges are interconnected. And so we have to make sure that our solutions are as well.
What do you think are the underlying causes of crime?
Well, central to crime, I often say, is poverty. It's been said that the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it's justice. I think that was Brian Stevenson who said that, and I think that's right. What poverty does is it creates a sense of desperation, and often from that desperation is where we lose safety and lose security. And, you know, when we talk about people that are desperate, it's not just desperate for resources, it's desperate for care, desperate for health care, desperate for mental health treatment, desperate for shelter, desperate for where someone's next meal is going to come from. All of those desperations are, the result of all of that desperation is what walks into our courtrooms every single day.
There are many people who are poor and desperate who don't commit crimes.
That's right. And God bless them for it. But there are a lot of people who are poor and desperate that do. And neither of us knows how we would respond if we found ourselves in a desperate situation. Now, I still have a responsibility to hold people accountable, and it's not necessarily an excuse. But if I'm looking for an underlying cause, poverty can be that. And if I can address that cause, or if I can address an underlying need that someone has, I'd be crazy not to do that if it's going to make our entire community safer.
Do you think there are people who are just bad?
I have seen some extremely horrible things done to people. I've seen, for 3 years of my life, I was a sex assault prosecutor. And in that time, I have prosecuted people who have raped over and over and over again, many times escaping accountability for it. And I have to walk away with that, realizing that let me say it this way, that the type of evil that one person inflicts upon another is inexplicable. And while I'm sure that if we were to dig deep down in the psyche of that particular person, we would find something that is sort of at the root of why it is that person decides to inflict that sort of pain. I'm a person of faith, and my faith teaches me that everyone has something redeeming about them. It's just very difficult to find it in certain types of crimes. That is a long way of answering your question, because I'm trying to be especially thoughtful about it, because I don't ever want to tell anybody and tell a child or tell, someone that there are people who are just unredeemably evil. But I have to say I've seen a lot of cases, and I've seen a lot of folks who repeatedly do some really bad things to people.
Prosecutors charge people with crimes. Do you like accusing people of crimes?
Well, I don't think that I'm accusing people of crimes. I think that what a prosecutor does is looks at the facts and evidence before them and decides whether to charge people with crimes based on those facts and evidence.
When you do charge, a charge is an accusation.
It is. Yeah, it is. And you don't take any You don't take any pleasure in accusing someone, but what you ought to take pleasure in as a prosecutor is telling the truth. And if someone has done something that is considered a crime against another person or a crime against the community at large, me signing a document that charges them with that is telling the truth. And I'm telling the truth not just on behalf of me and judging someone. I'm telling the truth on behalf of the community. And you have to see it that way. It's not about saying I'm better than anybody. It's about calling a particular crime to task. You have to be really careful not to just refer to people as bad people, but you have to remember that it's the act that you're prosecuting. When I talk to a jury before a trial, I tell them, the trial isn't about how bad a guy John Smith is. It's about whether or not John Smith committed this really bad act and proceed accordingly. And do I like the fact that I'm able to bring the truth of someone who survived that sort of crime to light? Absolutely. I think that's important. The number of women that and I talk about violence against women cases because I spent 5 years of my life prosecuting those cases. And in many cases, these women aren't believed. And I do take a lot of pride in taking their truth into a courtroom and making sure that at least on a single day in court, that truth comes to light. I think it's important for those survivors, and I think it's important for the community at large.
What guides whether you charge a person with a crime?
Whether the facts or evidence are there. There have been people that I've known in my heart that have committed an offense, but if I wasn't able to demonstrate that through the evidence available, I didn't do it. And there are times when, I have had the evidence available and the case comes to me and I've decided to charge them. The question is how I've decided to resolve the case. It's not always in a quote unquote prosecution. Sometimes it's, this person needs a break. Obviously you can't do that in every case. And depending on the seriousness or severity of the case, you treat it accordingly, but you do look at the circumstances that a person might find themselves in and act accordingly.
There has been some discussion in the campaign about decriminalizing the possession of marijuana. Can you state your position?
Yeah, I take an oath to uphold the laws of the state of North Carolina. And so North Carolina says the possession of marijuana is a crime. Now, the question is, how do I prioritize that among all of the many crimes there are? And the truth is that simple possession of marijuana is not something that's a high priority for the DA's office. It never has been. If people are selling a controlled substance outside of someone's front lawn, that's a bit of a problem. If someone is selling a controlled substance and all of a sudden someone gets robbed and have a gun stuck in their face because they know that they have small denominations of cash on them because they're engaging in the sale of a controlled substance, that's an issue. It's just pure recreational use that is going on in a neighborhood or someone who's suffering from an addiction. You deal with it one way, and that includes diversion programs, which can easily result in dismissals sometimes. If it's someone that you believe is selling something outside of a fragile neighborhood, you deal with it in another way. And so I think no matter what you do, you have to make sure you're bringing a sense of discernment to whatever sort of crimes that you're handling in the DA's office or anywhere else.
When you take the circumstances of a person's life into account, deciding whether to charge them or not, are you allowing personal bias to factor in?
I am. It's a check. You have to make sure that you bring your values and biases to everything that you do. The nature of this work means that you have to constantly make sure that it's not about you. And you are trying to make sure that you're doing what is truly just and making sure that the authority that you have, that you're applying in a way that's fair for everybody. And even though you may not share the same circumstances that someone else has, you've still got to make sure that you use your authority in a way that means that this system is, and this process is trustworthy for everybody. And that's an ongoing challenge. It's one of the reasons why sometimes I don't feel like I've had a good week unless I've actually faced one of those moral crises about whether or not I'm doing the right thing by everybody. Today's been one of those days.
Why has today been one of those days?
Can't even tell you, because it all involves pending cases. But I think the average prosecutor is going to touch about at least in this county, is going to touch about 5 cases. They're going to make you sit there and think about and struggle with what exactly is the right thing to do and the right outcome. And there are probably a lot of different answers to that question. What you try to do is develop a process about the way that you think about cases, where it guarantees that you have put fairness in every single segment of a decision that you make. And at least at the outset, whether that decision is quite frankly right or wrong, you can at least say that it's fair, and you can at least say that you would do that no matter what defendant was sitting in that chair.
Spencer, have you ever regretted prosecuting someone?
Yes, I have. And not because it wasn't the right thing to do to prosecute that person, but you recognize that it's just inherently sad. I talk about the notion of all of us in the criminal justice system being part of a tragedy. I used to bartend. I met my wife waiting tables, and I bartended in a restaurant. And the day that I left to actually start in the DA's office, I said to a customer, I was going from a place where when people were there, it was exactly where they wanted to be, to a place when they were there, it was the last place in the world they want to be. It's like courthouses and hospitals. And when you're seeing someone who's either done something wrong and they're personally coming to grips with the fact that they've done something wrong, there's an overwhelming level of sadness. For one thing, not everybody always really comes to that point, but when you actually see it, you realize, this is someone who's not going to see their family for a while. But you also realize that this is someone who's done something really awful to someone else. And they have to be held accountable for that. And there's not winning. People often talk about, prosecutors are all about winning. Nobody's winning in any of this. What you are able to do is bring the truth to light, and you're able to hold someone accountable for something awful that they've done to someone.
Is there a particular regret that comes to mind?
I remember a plea that I had, and it's not a regret, and so I may not be directly answering your question, and I realize that. But I remember a robbery case that I had where a guy was 30 years old, admitted forthrightly he stuck a gun in someone's face, denied it up and down for the longest time, and finally admitted it. And the level of true remorse that he was able to express, you could tell it was genuine. And he spoke with a true level of just connection with the family of the victim, because it was a young woman that he robbed. And you realize, well, this guy finally gets it. It took all of this for him to get it. That said, we often talk about the offender, and that's certainly serious when they have a portion of their life taken away. That young girl who had that gun stuck in her face is never going to get over that. That trauma is going to be with her for the rest of her life. And there's only but one person who inflicted that upon her. So we can't lose sight of that either.
How do you feel when someone you have charged is found guilty and sentenced to prison?
I don't care how long you've been doing this, and I've been doing it for 11 years, but when the jury comes back, you tremble. And even when the clerk reads the verdict, you tremble. And even through sentencing, all of that is, and the more serious the crime, it's not just you that trembles, but you see the response from jurors, and you see the response from judges, and people take this, as they should, extremely seriously. And it's an overwhelming feeling. You look behind you and you see the victims of these cases, and you can see it all just comes washing over them. There's this, for the first time, there's this sense of closure. Often it's, oh my gosh, these people actually believed me. You look over at the defendant and you see, oh my gosh, my life just changed in an instant. You look over at the jury and they realize the true gravity of the decision they just made. And this all plays out in a courtroom.
Have you ever wondered whether this job would harden you?
Yes, I have. What I've worried about is that this job would break me. I tried sexual assault cases for 3 years straight, and that was when I almost quit. Because every single time that you are engaging with someone who survived a crime like that and talking with them, you're living their experience, and that wears on you a great deal. You know, last year I had a really poignant experience where I was taking a homicide plea from someone who had committed an armed robbery, gotten out of prison, and 5 months later they shot someone in cold blood. And I'd gotten close to the family of the victim, and finally they came for the plea. We had the sentencing hearing, and all of a sudden I took them into a back room with my supervisor, who was himself a 25-year prosecutor. And all of a sudden we hear a knock at the door, and it is the mother of the defendant. And she says, "Can I come in?" And the family graciously says, "Sure." And she broke down in tears, and she apologized to that family. She says, "I'm so sorry for what my child did to your nephew." And they told her, "You don't have to apologize to us because you lost a child today as well." So to see the demonstration of grace that in the face of that kind of loss that a family is willing to exhibit, you're hardened, supposedly hardened prosecutor, and that moves you, and you realize easily that's not about you. You certainly have a role to play in this process, but a moment like that in the midst of that kind of tragedy is bigger than you.
Are you holding on to your grace on this job?
I am. I've come to grips with, faith has had to be a great part of the work that I've done, because you can't make these sorts of decisions that are so monumental on a daily basis. At least I can't, without being able to rely on a greater foundation and feel like there's got to be something bigger than just the work, and something bigger than the moment of court, when you feel like you're standing up for people who otherwise wouldn't be able to stand up for themselves. That's bigger than me. When you feel like you're helping someone through their pain, that's bigger than me. When you feel like you're calling attention to a wrong, I do feel like that's an act of grace. And it's the reason why when you have opportunities to leave this work, it's the reason why I haven't, because I'm not sure of anything that I could do with whatever skill I've been given that would be nearly as impactful.
Spencer, you do now lead law enforcement in this county. How could law enforcement and incarceration in Mecklenburg County be more just?
Well, I do take some issue with the notion of me leading law enforcement in this county. There are many law enforcement agencies. I have a critical role to play in the criminal justice system, and I think that there are things that I can do to impact, things like mass incarceration. I do feel like there are things that I can impact as far as the way that people, what sort of trust people have in our criminal justice system. And much of that I have to do by my own example. It's one of the reasons why, I've tried to engage in a very public way with people about what it is that I do and the types of things that I think about, because I think there's a certain level of transparency that I have to be willing to engage in to build trust. In terms of mass incarceration, I have to make sure that people understand and make sure that I am thoughtful about what I'm actually doing when I send a person to prison. One of the things that I did before, and I've visited a prison before, but mostly for work, in the context of a particular case. But before I took office, I actually took a day and visited Lanesboro Correctional Institute and just spent the day there and visited maximum security, medium security facility. And you do get a sense of, even just in a visit, of, what those circumstances can do to a person. And
in the 10 years that you were an assistant DA, you visited a prison once?
No, I took a prison tour once. I interviewed not many, but a few times I've interviewed people through the course of the work that I've done. But this is the only time that I did it not in the context of a case, but just took the tour.
And what impression did that make?
A big one, because you realize that, it's one thing as a line prosecutor. A line prosecutor deals with an individual case. Every single prosecution has my name on it as district attorney. And you realize that going forth, me walking in there before I actually even took office, I realized that this will be a lot of the people who end up in this place will be because my authority sent them there. And I think I would be callous if I hadn't given some thought to that before taking the office.
How are you internalizing that? The fact that the folks who will be in these prisons will be there because you're signing a document with your name on it.
It makes you extremely thoughtful about what it is that you do. That's how I internalize it. That I can never lose sight of that. It can never be cavalier for me to simply send a person to prison out of ease. That should be something that I should be thoughtful, and I should be making sure that that gets communicated to the people who work under my command as well. I believe that the 86 prosecutors that work in our office are thoughtful about that, but I've seen it, and having that image there with me, thinking about what a terribly impactful condition prison can be, that sticks with you.
Spencer, I'd love to talk about how you came to this point in your life. Your name is Spencer Merriweather III.
That's right.
Who were the Spencer Merriweathers who came before you?
My grandfather was from Butler, Alabama, and he moved to Mobile, Alabama to work sort of on the docks in the ship. And he had my dad. My father was the oldest son, and he was Spencer Jr., who was born and raised in Mobile, Alabama. And he grew up to be a math and art teacher, ultimately became a principal, and that was his day job. His night job was he was a parks and recreation director in what at that time was the poorest city in the state of Alabama, a place called Pritchard, Alabama.
You grew up in Alabama?
I did.
Where did you grow up?
Mobile, Alabama. Followed my dad, by the hip all the time. It had one of the coolest, environments in the world, in the sense that I would go to school and your dad is a parks and recreation director. So you were always within a foot of a board game. I always had access to a basketball court. I always had access to a baseball field. Also, I was an only child. I am an only child, but I had access to kids who were being kids and playing games. And for me, that I learned a lot of good and interesting lessons. When I was going to these centers, again, they were in places that my parents were working class, middle class. They were teachers. They weren't earning a lot, but they were certainly earning enough to send me to Catholic school, interestingly enough. But I would go to these centers, and everybody around me was certainly not of means, and some kids were in harm's way, and you learned a lot about other people and not just about their differences, but really what you had in common, and how to sort of negotiate those differences in ways that were constructive.
So you went to private school?
Catholic school, from kindergarten through 8th grade. The reason I went to Catholic school is because in Alabama at the time, kindergarten was only accessible through a lottery, and I lost because I demonstrated some early reading ability, and my parents were both educators. That was part of the reason my dad had the second job, was to try to get me as quickly as possible into a kindergarten program. Happened to be at a Catholic school, and I stayed there.
And your family's Catholic?
No, my father and mother both were Lutheran. You're about to hear the most ecumenical story ever. My mother was raised Baptist, went to a Presbyterian historically black college called Stillman in Tuscaloosa. My father was an African-American Lutheran. He ended up being a national officer in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. I went to Catholic school, and so 6 times out of a month, I was going to Catholic Mass, stayed with it when I went to college, and it wasn't until I got to Charlotte that I finally joined the faith.
So you were not confirmed as a teenager?
That's right. Got here, and I joined St. Peter's Catholic, and as you may know, it's a parish that's staffed by the Jesuits, and that has sort of been my moral compass since the time that I've been confirmed, and I've loved being a part of that parish and still do.
How would your friends have described you as a teenager?
I was intense. I was an intense kid. I was a bit of a prankster. I laughed a lot, still do, but I was an intense kid.
How were you intense?
I loved sports. I loved playing football, soccer before that. My parents took education very seriously. So, I talked about the fact that I love to play sports and I love to play, but when it was time to work, it was time to work. And over time, that ethic sort of took over in me, and I took my work very seriously through high school.
Where did you go to high school?
I went to high school at Murphy High School, which was one of the largest high schools in the state of Alabama, and actually was the first school to be integrated or desegregated in the state of Alabama.
And you did well.
Did well.
You did well enough to go to Princeton University.
I did. And
why Princeton?
Interestingly, I knew I wanted to have an experience entirely different than, where I grew up. I wanted to test myself. And at first I thought I wanted to go to DC and go to Georgetown. And then I got in a summer program after my sophomore year at the University of Pennsylvania and loved it. But I had a teacher in high school who was a retired college professor, Dr. Day, and he graduated in the Princeton class of 1958, and he encouraged me to visit. And when I visited, I fell in love with it. I said, this is college. And there was no looking back. It was the last college that I visited. Sadly, I'm still paying for it.
What did you study?
I was a politics major but I was able to get a certificate in both American and African American studies.
Well, you practiced some politics in college, didn't you? Because you were elected student body president.
I was. It was a good and interesting time. I enjoyed sort of being a citizen of the campus because it's a great campus to be a citizen of.
It's quite an achievement to become student body president of Princeton University.
Literally, I think I was elected to the position, well, one, because nobody ran against me. I had a very competitive election for vice president, but the next year sort of won by acclamation. And I swear it's because I had a great job my freshman year in the library, where before you entered the library and when you left it, I was the last person that you saw. When you swiped your library card, people's names came right across the screen. So I got a chance to know names and faces, and that's halfway to get elected to anything.
You were like the Walmart greeter at the Princeton Library.
Pretty much. That was me.
How did you do as president?
I did well. I mean, it was fun work. I almost got a chance to meet Nelson Mandela, but he got sick. And the types of people that are walking through the campus at Princeton are pretty great, and professors that are at your disposal.
Do you have a particular memory of your time at Princeton?
I got a lot of memories of my time at Princeton, and what I remember most is that I learned more sitting in the dining hall 2 hours after it closed than probably I did in any of my lecture halls, because you were sitting around these really bright kids who all had a perspective. The great thing about college like that is just how diverse it is. And when I say diverse, you're not just talking about people from different racial and cultural backgrounds, but I'm talking people from different countries. I'm sitting with a guy who's telling me about Singapore. I'm sitting with someone who's telling me about what it's like to, live in Fiji. I mean, that's different stuff, and certainly different from Mobile, Alabama. And it's those experiences that I remember the most. I remember meeting President Clinton. I remember meeting Julian Bond. I remember hearing Toni Morrison, having a front row seat to Toni Morrison reading from The Bluest Eye. But it's talking with some of these kids, some of these students, that was really impactful.
After Princeton, you worked as a congressional aide in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. What did you do?
I was a congressional associate for Eleanor Holmes Norton, who was the delegate from the District of Columbia. And so I was part of her legislative staff. I worked with the Congressional Black Caucus. I worked on some labor issues. I worked on issues involving aging, and I answered a lot of letters. And I was there during a very interesting time. In that time, I was sitting on the floor of the office at 3 o'clock in the morning during the 2000 election returns. I entered the Rayburn House office building when 2 Capitol Police officers told me that the World Trade Center had a plane flown into it. And I remember when the Capitol Hill phone lines went dead, and I remember all of the fear that had encompassed DC at the time during 9/11. I remember an anthrax scare. Had I gotten to the office just a little earlier, I would have actually taken a Cipro pill that probably would have made me sick. But luckily, I got there a little late, and they had already run out of their supply. It was a crazy time.
You then went to Chapel Hill for law school.
I did.
Why the law?
Eleanor Holmes Norton was a lawyer in SNCC, and she sort of demanded the most of her staff. And in order to sort of progress in the office, you needed to go to law school. And I thought about law school anyway. And I had a good role model in her as an attorney and things that you could do as an attorney. And so I knew I wanted to go to law school after even just a short time in DC, just a matter of where.
After Chapel Hill, you could have joined a national law firm and made a significant amount of money in private practice, but you chose the DA's office in Mecklenburg County.
So the summer after my first year in law school, I didn't exactly know what I wanted to do, and I thought it might be interesting to work in a DA's office, even though I thought criminal law was probably the last thing I really wanted to do, but I'd be inside of a courtroom, so that must be cool. But then I got here. Incidentally, it was the first place I ever owned a car, Charlotte, which is interesting because if you drive down the street, the name of that street might change 4 times, so that made it interesting. But I got here and I fell in love with the work. I realized just how impactful it could be. I was assigned to the homicide unit, and I sat in a room with families as they were learning about how cases would proceed, involving their loved one, their lost loved one. And that's when I realized I can make an impact. One of the things I realized was how few people who looked like me did this job, yet many of the victims of crime looked exactly like me. And I felt like there was a perspective I could bring to this work.
How do you feel when you see a young black man in jail?
Pretty bad, because I realized that but for different circumstances, that easily could be me. What doesn't get mentioned nearly as much is that for a while the face of mass incarceration often is a face of color. The face of a crime victim is also a face of color as well. And that is just as saddening to me as it is to see someone who's African-American behind bars.
Spencer, we discussed your pedigree, Princeton, congressional aide, UNC Chapel Hill Law School, now district attorney. It seems a perfect resume for higher office. Have you been managing your career, planning to run for public office one day?
No. I'm good. I've got the job that I want, got the job that I think I'm qualified for. And 15 years ago, I never thought I'd be sitting here talking to you about, what I'm doing as district attorney. So you leave everything open, but I didn't seek this job because I wanted to run for stuff. I didn't seek this job because I wanted to hold a title. I'm glad I have this job because over the course of the last 11 years, I've seen what an impact a prosecutor can make, and I'm excited about, what I'm able to do from this position.
There is a high correlation between people who are student body presidents and people who later run for public office. Haven't you been thinking about public office for some time?
No, if you remember correctly, I was not elected to the position of student body president. No one ran against me, and I was lucky enough to hold the spot. And that's certainly not the case now. But I do think that any job where you are engaging with people on a daily basis, and a number of people on a daily basis, and people feel as if you are accessible to them, that's probably going to be training for something. When I was president of the student body at Princeton, I answered to 4,500 kids, and that felt like something. And now I find myself answering to 1.1 million people in Mecklenburg County, and that feels like something too.
Let's play word association. Senator Merriweather.
I'm not playing that game. Yeah, I'm good. I feel good about the role that I've got. So you say Senator Merriweather, and I say DA Merriweather's just fine.
Have you ever marched for civil rights or protested in the streets?
Yes, I have, interestingly enough, with my mom and dad. Before the James Byrd case in I believe the 2000s, the last known lynching in the United States was the lynching of someone named Michael Donald. And that happened in Mobile. Michael Donald actually went to my high school. And in response to that lynching, my mother held the hand of her, I believe, 2-year-old son at that point. And we walked down the streets of Mobile in protest. And over time, there have been a number of things that I've been walked in protest for, but that is one that I am notably proud of because in many ways it was sort of the passing of a legacy of the airing of grievances, which our Constitution allows us to do.
When we had the protests in Charlotte in September of 2016, what was on your mind?
It's interesting to me because I knew that at that point I was a senior prosecutor and I was watching, and I was also a resident of Charlotte. And I'm watching, that level of fury explode and realizing that there were so many things, that were tied up in that, the death of another African-American, realizing that all of the imbalance in our community as far as resources and as far as structural racism throughout, that all came to bear a couple nights in September. For me, I realized that in light of the death that had taken place, that was going to get reviewed by the office where I worked. And instantly I realized that I was in a leadership position in the district attorney's office. And I wanted to make sure that I was in that room. I thought I had a perspective to bring to bear in the review of the case that was at the center of that protest and that uprising. And I wanted that to be a part of the discussion. So I actually went to at that time, my predecessor, and I said, I want to be in on the review. And he says, oh, don't worry, you're actually going to be in on the review, and I want your perspective, and I want to hear what you have to say. And so, after the investigation was completed by the State Bureau of Investigation, I reviewed this case thoroughly, and I did it alone. And I brought every question that I could to bear. It's really important for me because I saw that death as one that was impactful for me. I saw it just like every other African-American person saw that, which is that easily could have been me. And so whatever decision the district attorney's office was going to come up with based on the evidence, I wanted to make sure that it was something that was indeed justified by facts and be able to answer for it. That's one goal. The other goal was to make sure that family of Keith Lamont Scott was treated like a family that lost a loved one. And if there's anything from that experience for which I felt a great sense of responsibility to make sure that the office treated that family well, didn't lie to them, and allowed them to answer every question, and again, treated them with great empathy.
What did your personal review conclude?
My personal review concluded exactly what was filed in that report, which is that under the law, that shooting, while horrible and while it was a tragedy, that the law justified it. When you say that, you realize that you have to say the same thing that I've said to a number of families who've lost loved ones, which is, you're not supposed to like this. I can't even tell you this is right. What I can tell you is that I can't lie to you, and I have to tell you what the law and the evidence says, it dictates in this case. I would want that family to know, I would want the Scott family to know, is that there's nothing right about that, loss of life. And there's no joy. And every time that someone loses a loved one at the hands of forced by the government, that's bad. And it undermines our sense of justice and safety. And that's just the truth, whether justified by the law or not. But it is a tragedy, and it's a tragedy for all of us. It's hard work. The only thing that sort of keeps you motivated and keeps you on task in the wake of that kind of work is the fact that the loss that families feel through all this is so much worse. During the protest, what I realized is that I did have this overwhelming sense of responsibility, and that I had to make sure that I was going about the work and keeping my head clear and keeping my eyes focused on the task at hand. That all of the training, all of the work, and all of the experience that I've accrued over the course of, at that point, 9 years, this is when it counts. I'm applying my perspective to the work. That's what I was called upon to do.
Spencer, you mentioned your faith. How does your Catholicism inform your work?
A number of different ways. One, you must bring a sense of humility to every single work that you do. My faith calls on me to be mindful of my smallness and to be mindful of the fact that I am but a small atom in all that's going on in this world, and that there's something larger at work, and I am but an instrument of the will of my Creator. My faith teaches me that there's something breathed into me that inspires me to do good things. And the hope is that I answer to that inspiration in the work that I do. There are some particular Jesuit principles that are really important for me that motivate me as well. One of those is men and women for others. One of those is what we refer to as magis, which is you must do more. Another principle is a principle of social justice, and that social justice in connection with charity. Charity is important, but it is important for all of us to create just systems. And it would be impossible for me to engage in this sort of work and be true to my faith without trying to make larger systems more just.
When you look back on your life many years from now, what will you have wanted your life to have been about?
When I was working for Eleanor Holmes Norton, she assigned me to be a director for a commission on Black men and boys, going out and finding good people who were good role models, who were helping the advancement of African American boys. And in dealing with a shoe hospital guy who ran a football league, I was trying to find another guy who coached. And in finding that guy who coached, he says, oh yeah, he's like, tell that guy I said, hey, you'll like him. He's a good brother. I remember thinking that day, that's like the highest compliment anybody could ever give to anybody. He's a good brother. When I pass, or when I'm 50 years from now, I don't care if somebody says that I was DA in Mecklenburg County or that I was student body president at Princeton, but it'd be real nice if somebody said I was a good brother.
Thanks for your time today, Spencer.
Thank you.
Spencer Merriweather is the Mecklenburg County District Attorney. He earned a BA in politics with certificates in American and African American Studies from Princeton University and a J.D. from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And now, a personal word. Spencer Merriweather challenged my view of prosecutors. His outward manner is humble and compassionate. He self-examines and thoughtfully engages. He talks about systems and structures and the weight of his responsibility. Everything about him was kind. I liked him even though I didn't want to like him because I have never really liked what prosecutors do. My exposure to prosecutors has been limited to the wannabe federal and state prosecutors I knew in law school many years ago, and to the few I knew when I first practiced law. Not a large sample, but most prosecutors whom I met were either very ambitious and saw being a prosecutor as resume building for public office, or they were intense law and order types who took weird satisfaction seeing people convicted of crimes. Most of them talked about justice, but few of them talked about fairness. All of them kept score. Prosecutors do work I could never imagine doing. They accuse people on behalf of the state. They use the power of government to enforce rules and penalties. They work hard to marshal the law and facts to see people sentenced. Their efforts result in human beings being imprisoned, and in some cases, being executed. Their handiwork is mass incarceration. Their work often seems righteous and hard-hearted. I've been far more sympathetic to public defenders. Defense attorneys stand up to the machinery of the state. They defend the poor and downtrodden. They are willing to buck the mob and throw a hammer against Big Brother. They protect our rights against overzealous accusations. They are often the lone person between tyranny and freedom. But that is an easy narrative, and unkind and incomplete. I know better. I know that prosecutors are also the voice of citizens who have been hurt and traumatized. That prosecutors hold perpetrators of awful crimes to account. That they uphold the rules of society that civilize us. That they are good and decent people who know more than anybody the power and responsibility in their hands. I know that defense attorneys are no more noble than prosecutors. That everyone in criminal justice plays their part in a flawed system that strains to get it right. That no one in the system is a hero, and everyone in the system is a hero. That if democracy works at all, it works because lawyers and witnesses and judges and jurors and jailers and clerks and social workers are showing up to do unpleasant work. Work that allows everyone else who is not in the system to live as if the system is someone else's problem. All of this is what I checked in myself as I listened to Spencer. My views and feelings shifted by the moment, from discomfort that anyone could be a prosecutor, to admiration for his career achievements and his genuineness and humanity given the work that he does with the spirit with which he does it, to appreciation for all who do the work that I do not want to do, that creates space and place that allows me to comment from my privileged perch. How fortunate am I that Spencer is in the trenches? The day may come that attorneys and staff from his office are counseling me. The day may come when criminal justice is as personal to me as it is to him and to those who go to work in it every day. All of these thoughts cross my mind. As District Attorney, Spencer Merriweather is the face of justice in Mecklenburg County. Justice in our community may be complicated. We may have mixed emotions about the system, but gratitude for the good people who serve is a good place to start. This is Mark Paris, and you've been listening to On Life and Meaning. Additional support for this podcast is provided by the UNC College of Arts and Architecture, celebrating a decade of creative education in the arts and design. Thank you to our funding partners, and to my teammates, Andy Go, producer of the show, and to Chris Curriton, Art and Media Director. This is how you can help. Please write a review on iTunes. It helps us grow our audience. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And become a patron. We are on Patreon, a crowdsourcing platform that allows you to support what you value at a level you choose. Visit us also on our website, onlifeandmeaning.com. Thank you for listening.